Thank you all very much. It's good to be back home. I have many fond memories of this place. The door's always open. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I am honored to have been asked to speak today. And Susan said something to me about, some of you may remember I gave kind of a talk on homosexuality and sexuality in the Bible about 25 years ago.
I remember it well.
And Susan says to me, well, can you just resurrect your old notes? I said, Susan, I can't find my Amarin bill to pay it. So, resurrecting old notes is not likely to happen, and I'm not a person that works off a manuscript anyway, so this is kind of off the cuff. So let's get right into it. I belong to Gethsemane, which is a reconciled in Christ congregation. We went through it about 10 years ago after a couple years of study and have been very satisfied with the results. We have a large number, I would say, of gay and lesbian persons in our parish. Normally I would like to say to someone, are you gay? But after a while, even the worst gaydar starts to wiggle, okay? And you start to see, we have a lot of folks here who are paired as lesbian and gay people, and they are very active in our parish, and we are very proud and happy to have them. So I'm wishing your parish a lot of good things and luck as you go through that process yourself. So we're going to talk about sex. That always gathers a crowd, right? Better than talking about taxes. Okay. And so, as I talk about it, I'm going to work it around the concept of how we decide, looking at the Bible, how we decide what is right and what is wrong, and how the church has done that over a period of years with the Bible as the core. And the first thing I would have to say about that is that when God tells us something, we have to remember that it always comes wrapped in a context. And we have to look at the context in which God tells us something. Now, if you were a latchkey kid, you probably remember that you got home from school about 3:30, but your parents didn't get home until about 5, so you were given a key and you went in the house, and your mother told you, don't open the door for any strangers. And you said, yes, okay. But now, if you're 50 years old and the police come knocking on your door, it's not wise to say, my mother told me not to open the door for you, because the police will probably kick it in. So the context of what your mother said, even though you tend to be wanting to honor her, has changed a great deal. So we have to keep in mind what the context of some of the things in the Bible are. So let's go back to kind of the beginning of things. When a baby is born, it's always obvious who the mother is, because the body that you came out of is your mother. Who your father is always a bit more of a mystery. And ancient peoples realized this too, and they wanted to do something about that. So one of the purposes of sexuality, the way people looked at it, was the obtaining of legitimate children. In other words, children that you knew were yours. The other purpose of sex, which hasn't gone anywhere, is pleasure. So those were the two purposes of sex: to give yourself pleasure and to obtain some children that you knew as a man were yours. Now, and when I say as a man, keep in mind that when we look at biblical texts, and as a matter of fact, all ancient texts, almost all were written by men for men. If you're looking for women's issues to be discussed in detail, you're going to be very, very disappointed. We have to infer what women's lives were like. We have to infer what women's sexualities were like, because men were not terribly interested in that. So we don't have a great record of that. We have a much fuller record of what men said about men and to other men. So in the ancient world, among the Hebrews, adultery, remember, was a property crime. It had nothing to do with feelings. People didn't marry someone because they fell in love with them. They didn't even marry someone because they liked them. Most marriages were arranged between young girls and men who were a bit older. Often the girl was engaged when she was a child or even a baby. And when she began her menstrual cycles, then she was married to the man. That was 12 or 13 years old. When you picture the Virgin Mary, don't picture Sophia Loren. Picture a 13-year-old girl. This is what we're talking about. Girls were married young. Their reproductive careers wanted to start early and often. And lifespans were not as long in those days. People did not expect to have great-great-grandchildren. The few that did were very, very lucky. Many people died of old age in their late 40s. So people wanted to begin reproductive careers early. But adultery, when the Bible says you must not commit adultery, it's talking about a property crime. It's talking about taking away the sexual services of a woman who is not yours. So, in the biblical way of looking at things, a married man had every right to visit a prostitute because she was the one woman in society whose sexuality belonged only to herself. And if he was married, he was not doing anything wrong. A woman, however, her sexuality always belonged to someone. When she was a young girl, it belonged to her father. When her father affianced her to someone else, her sexuality then belonged to her espoused husband and then her husband. If she became a widow, she was in charge of her grown sons, or the male in her family that was closest to her. A woman did not own her own sexuality. It always belonged to someone unless she was a whore. Now, I'm going to look at something in the Bible that I think is kind of instructive. This is kind of an interesting chapter, if I can find it. It's the 38th chapter of Genesis. There's a lot of stuff in here that's interesting. We're going to talk about it. Chapter 38. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. Biblical slang for they had sexual relations. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Think about that for your next child. Again, she conceived and bore a son whom she named Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she named him Shelah. She was in Shezib when she bore him. Judah took a wife for his firstborn son. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, second son, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up her offspring for your brother." This was called levirate marriage. If a man died childless, his brother was to take the widow as his wife, and the first child born to that woman would be counted as the child of her dead husband. That way she would have social security. She would have someone to care for her in her old age. Okay. Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother. But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. It's getting kind of gruesome. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." And he feared that he too would die like his brothers, so Tamar went to live at her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died, and when Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to the sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down in the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her. He went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adullamite to recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, "Where is the temple prostitute who was at Enaim by the wayside?" But they said, "No prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and he said, "I have not found her." Moreover, the townspeople said, "No prostitute has been here." Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, otherwise we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid and couldn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more right than I am, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not lie with her again. Different world than ours, right? A different world. Okay. Judah didn't do right by this woman. He should have married her to the youngest son, but he was afraid. I mean, she had not been good luck for the first two. So he was a little wary to give her to his last remaining son, but by law, that's what he should have done, and he didn't do it. Now, what do we think about that? If your older brother died, is that what you would do? If your older brother died, would you take his wife into your house and impregnate her?
I can't.
Stand up. Any man here, any man whose wife would not object to that? Okay, so why don't we do that anymore? Because it was part of the Palestinian context of people who were, I don't know what you would say, herdsmen, that this was how sexual relations were handled. That if one son died without an heir, that was very hard on the wife. She had nobody. In order to make a social security net for her, another brother had to provide her with an heir. We don't do that. We have other ways of handling sexuality now. When I was in my teens is when the pill came out. And I remember that for those of us who are as old as I am, and I know there's not many people here as old as I am, but those of us who are as old as I am remember that it was quite a revolution, the pill, that you could take a pill and have sex and not get pregnant. I mean, that was an amazing thing. When birth control began to be bandied about in the early 60s, almost all the churches were against it. Not just the Catholic Church. Particularly the Episcopal Church was very vocally against birth control. And I remember reading something that they put out about it, and they said birth control is against the Bible because it is Onanism. All right, we just read the story of Onan. What did Onan do? Well, in medical terms, it's called coitus interruptus. In other words, he initiated the sex act, but at the time it finished, he did not deposit his semen inside the woman. That was his way of doing birth control. And what did Onan get for that? He got killed. So the Episcopal Church said birth control is wrong. Look at it, it's in the Bible. Here's a guy that tried to have birth control and he got killed by God. So if you take the pill, what is the obvious thing that's going to happen to you? Okay, context. Context, context. What Onan did, as we recognize now, was not wrong because it was birth control. It was wrong because he was refusing to provide the safety net for his sister-in-law that she needed in order not to be a starving old person with no one to care for her. It had very little to do with the modern concept of limiting one's family so that one can afford to feed and educate the children that one has. Very different concept. Many of the Old Testament passages that are rather unfriendly toward gay people come from Leviticus. I ran into a couple of them last night, and I thought, well, these are interesting. In Leviticus 18:22, it is said, here's the whole paragraph. You shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is in her menstrual uncleanness. You shall not have sexual relationships with your kinsman's wife and defile yourself with her. You shall not give any of your offspring to sacrifice them to Moloch, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. You shall not have sexual relations with any animal and defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman give herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. It is perversion. Okay, that's a whole paragraph. And there's another one in Leviticus 20, verse 13. I'll read the whole paragraph again. If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. The man who lies with his father's wife has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. If a man lies with his daughter-in-law, both of them shall be put to death. They have committed perversion, and their blood is upon them. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death, and their blood is upon them. If a man takes a wife and her mother also, it is depravity, it is also crazy. They shall be burned to death, both he and they, that there may be no depravity among you. If a man has sexual relations with an animal, he shall be put to death, and you shall kill the animal. Where's Randy Grimm when we need him? If a woman approaches any animal and has sexual relations with it, you shall kill the woman and the animal. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Wow. Okay, these passages are often adduced as a reason why homosexuality is very, very sinful. You notice that adultery is too. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but think of all the people you know at this church and at any other church who may have at some point in their lives committed adultery. Is anybody going to stand up and say, let's put them to death? Seriously? Many of these passages are cherry-picked. And so if you want to say that the Bible says that a man having sexual relations with a man is wrong, fine. Then you need to be writing your congressman and saying that adulterers need to get the death penalty as well. Because you don't get to cherry pick, folks. If it's in the text, and if you're going to be a literalist about the text, let's do the whole thing. Let's do that thing about the animal too. If a man has sex with an animal, you got to kill the animal as well as the man. Now, did the animal have a choice in this sex act? No, but Leviticus says the animal's got to die too. If you look at those sections of Leviticus, and they're not the world's most exciting reading, but sometime when you have time, read what's called the Holiness Code in Leviticus, around there in the 18th, 19th, 20th chapters. There's other things that Leviticus forbids as well. For one thing, it forbids tattoos. Anybody here got one? Leviticus also forbids wearing any cloth that is made of two different fabrics. Anybody here wearing something that is cotton and nylon? There's another one going.
I'm just gonna keep my hand up.
Another one going straight to hell. Okay. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on this either, but it also forbids sex during a woman's menstrual period. I think that has probably been known to happen during Christian history at some time. Now, what we have to remember about the ancient world, and this goes for the Old Testament and the New Testament, the entire period, probably up to Luther's time, is that if you could put yourself back in that era and talk to these people and say, I want to talk to you about gayness, they would say to you, what? There was no concept in the ancient world that there were certain people who were inclined toward folks of their own sex. There was no notion of that. There is nothing in any ancient literature, Hebrew, Christian, pagan, Greek, Roman, that indicates that anyone believed that. Sexual acts were simply seen as a choice. If you're a man, it's a weekend, you want some fun, you might pick a boy, you might pick a girl. Anyone can do either one. I can't tell you how many American males I've spoken to have said, oh, I could never do that, I could never have sex with a man. Well, in the ancient world, that isn't how they looked at it. They looked at it as a man could, if he wanted to, have sex with another man. He could also have sex with a woman. Now, there were laws surrounding it, but in terms of proclivity, they would not recognize the idea that there are gay people. There are people who are oriented in this direction. We have come to see in the modern context that there are people who, from birth, from early childhood, find themselves different than other people and attracted to folks of their own sex. There are kids as young as 8 or 9 years old who recognize already that they are attracted to folks of their own sex. In ancient times, this was just unheard of. And so if you're looking for the Bible to speak to the issue of gayness per se, you're not going to find it, because sexual acts with a man came in a different context. A sex with a man was simply a decision that one made. Now, as we move into the New Testament, we look into what Jesus said. And Jesus lived in a Palestinian context. In terms of sexuality, probably the most provocative thing that Jesus said, and we don't recognize it now because we take it for granted, we really shouldn't. Jesus came out as foursquare against divorce. Foursquare against divorce. Divorce is a sin, it is wrong, it is breaking apart what God has put together. Again, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands who on here might be on a second or third marriage, because my hand would have to go up. So I'm not going to embarrass you and embarrass myself. But divorce is a commonality of our era. Jesus was completely against it. And it's one of the very few things of that nature, of a sexual nature, that Jesus dealt with in the New Testament. Now, why did Jesus say that? And what should we make of it? Well, in the early days, when I was a little kid, we took that seriously. If you got divorced, you left the parish, right? Forget clergy. Even among lay people, you were often not welcome in your church anymore if you divorced. You left the parish. You kind of scrambled off somewhere else, and hopefully you would join somewhere else where you weren't so notorious for what you had done. And divorce among the clergy, that was the end of your career. That was it. And that is true when I came through seminary. So that is not ancient times. Divorce was the end of your career. We're done. But in the Palestinian context, keep in mind that Jesus is talking to Palestinian people who lived in villages. And divorce could only be initiated by the man. A woman could not divorce her husband. It didn't happen any more than my dog could go to Schnucks and buy a steak. A woman could not divorce her husband. Divorce was something a man did to get rid of a wife who was his property, much as you might sell your lawnmower. You know, this lawnmower isn't working anymore, I want a better one, give me 10 bucks for it and you take it off. A woman could not divorce her husband. A husband only divorced his wife. The two main reasons for divorce among Palestinian Jews was that she was infertile And of course, if no children came, it was always her fault, always. So a man would quite often divorce a woman who had not given him children. And the other reason was that a more advantageous match was out there. Let's say this man was a baker, and he sees that another family that owns a bakery has a very eligible looking daughter, much younger than the woman he's stuck with. And if he marries her, that will ally two families and they will make more money because he will have the resources of his in-laws now. So it makes sense for him to get rid of the woman who is old and rather ugly and not doing him any good and marry this young girl. There was nothing wrong with that in the Hebrew context until Jesus opened his big mouth and said, divorce is wrong. You don't dump a woman out. Most of these women were forced into prostitution. And so what Jesus said about divorce was extremely feminist. It was extremely feminist in his context. Now, does that apply to the 21st century when two people just look at each other across the table and say, you know, this isn't working? We'd both be happier if we lived apart, we've raised our kids. Probably not. In those cases, the woman is not going to be forced into prostitution. Most women in our context can make a good living. Our courts have put things in such a way that marital property is divided fairly, unlike in Palestinian Judaism, and nobody should walk out of a divorce impoverished, that there should be a fair division of assets, and we recognize that. So the context of the whole teaching on divorce, we have to recognize, has changed. I bet there's not a person here who doesn't have a divorce in their family. If not their own, their son, their daughter, their sister, their brother, their parents. Because it is the nature of modern marriage that in order not to kill each other, sometimes we have to do that. When you get into St. Paul, you're looking at an urban context. Jesus spoke to Palestinian villagers. Now, St. Paul, who also has a great number of things to say about sex and sexuality, St. Paul preached primarily to sophisticated urban Christians, probably a whole lot better educated than Jesus' audience, people who knew the Greek world and were very much influenced by the Greek world, and held a lot of the suppositions of the Greek world. So I'm going to read you something out of 1 Corinthians here that is often cited in these discussions of homosexuality. This is from the 6th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Now remember, Paul knows this Corinthian congregation. He feels very called upon to scold them whenever he wants to since he started the parish. When you start the parish, you can run your mouth a little bit better than somebody who just came. So Paul is scolding this parish over a number of things, and he says, all right, okay. When any of you has a grievance against another, do you dare to take it to court before the unrighteous instead of taking it before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? So, that being the case, if you have a plumber at your house and he doesn't do the job right, and you go to court and say, I want my money back, you better find out if he's a Christian first. You better hope he's Jewish. Because the Bible says you don't go to court against another Christian. So next time you decide to sue somebody, you better find out what their religion is, because St. Paul says you don't go to court against other Christians. Do you not know that we are to judge angels, to say nothing of ordinary matters? Okay. Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers. None of these will inherit the kingdom of God. We read the list again, in case you missed it. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers. Do we know anybody like that? Who's always calling other people names? Nothing's coming to me. Robbers. Okay, these are the people who will not inherit the kingdom of God. And the two that people like to pick out are the ones that are, in my translation, the New Revised Standard, are called male prostitutes and sodomites. The Greek words for those are a little obscure. We kind of get the gist of what they mean, but they may, we're putting modern terms on them. You have to remember that in the urban Greek world to which Paul spoke, it was imbued with Greek culture. Now, Alexander the Great was the first conqueror, and I don't know, maybe the only one. I have to think about that. Other conquerors, when they conquered the world, all they wanted was money. They took your crops, they took your women as slaves, they took whatever jewelry you had, and then they left. But Alexander was a different conqueror. He wanted the whole world to have his culture. So when he conquered a country, he did all the stuff other conquerors did. He took the money and the women and the jewels, but he also left behind Greek culture and insisted that people be taught in the Greek way because he thought it was the best life, the best way. And in the first century, when our New Testament was written, pretty much everybody agreed with him, except the Hebrews and then the Christians, that the Greek way was the best. So the Greek way of thinking was how most of the sophisticated world lived in Paul's time. The Greeks were very, very open to homosexuality. But let me say that it was different than the homosexuality that we probably see around us. When I think of homosexuality, I think of going to Schnucks and seeing, two young men with one basket between them arguing about which kind of pasta to buy. And it's just one of those things that I would never have seen as a young woman, but now people are very open about the fact that they're married. There's a fellow running for president on the Democratic side who has a husband. He is a gay man with a husband. Pete Buttigieg, I think his name is pronounced. He's a gay man with a husband to whom he is married. Can you imagine that even 20 years ago? But this is how things are. Now, in the ancient world, homosexuality came from a different place. Plato and all the other Greek philosophers believed that women were by nature inferior to men. A pregnancy that was healthy produced a boy. A pregnancy that went wrong produced a girl. This is where you got women from. The pregnancy went wrong. So the highest form of life is male. Males had rationality. Females had only emotion. So if a man wanted a real serious relationship with someone who was on his level, not like a relationship between me and my dachshund, but a relationship with somebody I could talk to my tax situation about, that's going to be, in the Greek way of thinking, another man. Because a woman couldn't possibly give you the kind of spiritual, intellectual, rational companionship that you could only get from another man. And so the Greeks were very open to homosexual relationships because it was the best kind of friendship. It was friendship with an equal. Now, among people of means in the Greek world, the way they raised their sons was to send them away. And I tell you, if you've ever raised teenagers, you'd like the idea of sending them away when they get to be about 13. I would like to have sent all mine away. When their boys reached about 13 years old, they sent them to the home of a friend to be raised. So people raised each other's teenagers. Maybe that's easier, I don't know. But they would choose a friend, of course, of their own social class, and they would send their boy to be raised by this fellow who would educate him, teach him the ways of the world, teach him good literature and how to get himself involved in public life. And this man would be your son's role model. These relationships were very often homosexual. When it would be an older man, say someone in his 50s, and a 13 to 14-year-old boy. Now, so most long-lasting homosexual relationships were not relationships of equals, not like the two guys at at the grocery store who are arguing over which kind of pasta to buy. It's an older man who is in a relationship with a child. What's our word for that? Pedophilia. Pedophilia, because a 13-year-old boy, by common consent, cannot give consent. He's only a 13-year-old boy. We're not talking about two adults who love each other and want to form a life together. We're talking about an older man and a younger boy. And not to be too graphic about it, but in the ancient world, and this was more true among the Romans than the Greeks, the Romans too thought there was nothing wrong with having a boy lover as long as you were the active participant and not the passive participant. So the only shame was in being the receptacle. If you were the active participant, there was nothing wrong with that. And in these relationships of older men with young teenage boys, the older man was always the active participant. The younger man was the receptive participant, which of course had a lower status. So when Paul is talking about how he is against, he uses the term male prostitutes. The word for that in Greek insinuates the passive participant. Okay, and when he uses the term sodomites, as they use in the New Revised Standard, that insinuates the active participant. So he is saying both of them are wrong. Homosexuality is wrong because he didn't like what he saw. It wasn't the modern thing that we see, which is two men who love each other and want to form a life together, with or without children. So we have to be careful when we throw these passages around that what St. Paul is talking about is the same thing that we are talking about. Okay? If Paul could see Pete Buttigieg and his husband together, would he think that's so awful? I mean, I can't speak for Paul, and he's not here, but you have to recognize that we're dealing with a very different kind of thing here. So, how do we decide what's right in sexual matters? Here we are, we're stuck in the 21st century, and we've got to decide what's the right thing to do? What's the correct thing to do? And of course, we want to know what the Bible says. But how do you judge what's in there? I made a little list here. These are things that the Bible says are wrong. Are you ready? And I want you to note these. If you do any of them, I want you to stop. Stop. First of all, women who go to church without their hair completely covered. Is anyone here guilty of that? And when St. Paul said he wanted your hair covered, he didn't mean one of those stupid hats like the royal family wears perched in the side of your head. He meant like a hijab. Okay, cover your hair. How many of you went to church with your hair covered today? Nobody. Another thing, one Christian going to court against another. Last time you went to court, was your opponent a Christian? Did you bother to ask? Women braiding their hair. Okay. Women wearing pearls. I'm looking for pearl earrings. Bishops being unmarried. Paul said bishops must be married. Eating pork and shrimp. Not circumcising your sons. Walking more than 3/4 of a mile on the Sabbath.
Yes!
Find
Exercise today, people!
the one you like. Women teaching men.
Oh, you're all.
Okay, here we go. These are all things that the Bible is pretty sure are wrong. So when we look at the Bible for instruction on how to view sexual matters, what do we do? Well, here's what Luther said. Luther said that when you look at the Bible, God is in all parts of the Bible. He's in the Old Testament, he's in the New Testament. Some commentators, some Protestants said, well, you just toss the Old Testament, you look at what the New Testament said. Luther said, no, no, no. God is in all parts of the Bible. From Genesis to Revelation, God is in every book. However, when you look at how to evaluate what they say, he had a German phrase for it. I guess it's German. Yeah, was Christum treibt. Whatever conveys Christ. So you look at these passages through the eyes of your knowledge of Jesus Christ. Almost like what would Jesus do? Okay? So let's think about that. How did Jesus deal with people who were outcasts? Whores, lepers, tax collectors, poor people, adulterers. How did Jesus deal with those people? Did he unwelcome them to his ministry? No.
He would have friended them on Facebook.
That's right. He wrapped his arms around them. Did he say to himself, if I let this prostitute listen to the Sermon on the Mount, there's a guy over here who's been given a lot of money and he might leave. Did Jesus say that? No. Do you think Jesus ever took a poll and said, well, we got 83% approval, but I don't know, that's 17%. They're pretty prominent people. Can you imagine that? How did Jesus decide how to treat people?
By his heart.
By his heart. And his heart was full of love. Jesus treated people with love. I will remind you of this and of how the church has acted through the years as I close off here. In the 1820s, surgeons had discovered anesthesia. And they had used it on, as you know, if you're in the medical field, you can't open someone's abdomen without anesthesia. It's simply impossible. Even if you had 10 men holding them down, the muscles won't relax enough for you to get in there and do what you need to do. So anesthesia made surgery possible. And doctors were beginning to experiment with using anesthesia in childbirth to relieve the pains of childbirth. At a certain point, when the baby's head is crowning and the woman is miserable, you can give her some of that gas and it all goes away. They were experimenting with this, but the church spoke out against it. The church said this is a sin, and any surgeon who does it will find himself excommunicated. Why is it a sin? Because in Genesis, God said to Eve, you will bear children in pain. Now, I'm betting most of you girls out there had some sort of anesthesia. What made the difference? Queen Victoria. When she had her first child, she called for the gas. And the Church of England shut up. There was no more discussion of anesthesia being sinful once Queen Victoria began her brood of 9 children. When the Queen wants anesthesia, the Bible has been put to one side or looked at in a very different way. So I would urge you as a parish, as you look toward this decision you've got to make, however you vote on it, I would say, vote the way you think is right. Vote the way you think Jesus would act in our context. How Jesus would think, what Jesus would do. And remember that your kids are watching you. Your teenagers are watching you. Now, your teenagers say to yourself, oh, my kids aren't gay. Maybe, maybe not. I'll say this, my son Dietrich, who for the record is straight, has a best friend who's a gay man. And where Rich isn't welcome, Dietrich won't go. Your children have gay friends. Those of you who have small children or young children, your children may be gay. You don't know. You won't know for a long, long time. I ask you that when you make this decision, do what is right. Don't put your finger to the wind and take a poll. Don't ask yourself, what will the collection plate look like if we do this? Do what's right. Whatever you think is right. Do what you think is right. Because that's how Jesus did it. And that's how we interpret the Bible. Thank you very much.
Do you take any questions? Do
Yes.
we have any questions?
Questions? I'd love to have questions.
Yeah, go back to that thing about women braiding their hair. What was the context of that? I'm having a hard time wrapping my brain
First or
around it.
Second Timothy, I can't remember which one. The writer of the letter said that women should not be adorned, they should be plain. No braided hair, no pearls, no fancy clothes.
Okay. What was wrong with that?
The Christian ethic in the early years was very conservative. Christians were very conservative about sexuality, about money, about marriage. They wanted to blend in and look respectable. So women look the most respectable if they don't show off. In the Greek world, as a matter of fact, women very often never left the home. Romans were more permissive about that, and their wives ran around doing various things. But in the Greek world, women were to stay inside the house, literally. So Christians wanted to show that they were law-abiding, that they were simple, ordinary people who were good to society. They didn't want their women to look like prostitutes or like they were showing off. A good woman was a modest woman. Questions, comments? Anybody bring their pearls away? Yeah.
We have this Young County Times, January 25, 31 issue. And we're here in Sunset Hills discussing this. Friendship Village, you're familiar with Friendship, they're in Sunset Hills. And there's a lesbian couple.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah.
Which church runs Friendship Village? Does anybody know? I know it's church-oriented.
Presbyterian.
Yeah.
Really? Presbyterian Church of the USA?
I'm not sure of that.
PCA. Okay,
Because
the PCA is the Missouri Synod of Presbyterianism.
That's true.
Okay, they're
Anyway,
the,
Friendship Village has denied them.
Right.
living with it. And they went to court.
Right.
The case was dismissed, but they're going to bring it up again.
yeah, they're going to the Supreme Court with it. They're going to the Supreme Court. Now, the question is, our government prohibits discrimination on all sorts of bases, you know, handicap, race, blah, blah, blah. It's been squishy about sexual orientation. Sometimes it prohibits that, and sometimes it doesn't. Now, we now have a majority of conservatives on the Supreme Court. So we're going to have to see where that goes at the Supreme Court. The thing that gives me hope, and frankly, I'll just tell you, I'm no fan of the president and the cohort around him, is that the president has managed to piss off John Roberts. So even though John Roberts is a conservative, he doesn't mind sticking his finger into Trump's eye right now. So we might have some hope on that one. I feel for these women. They could have lied about it. They could have said we're cousins and we live together. Okay? And nobody would have known different. Two sisters have often lived together. My aunt and my grandmother lived together. They could have lied about it, but they don't want to do that.
So do people like that have to have a separate place where they can live and away from everybody else? If that is the case?
Excuse me. What the PCA would say to that, and the Missouri Synod, I might add, is that those two women should go through therapy and become heterosexual. Forget that in water. That there. Got some face.
She has some.
Conservative groups still buy the notion that homosexuality is something you decide to do. That you say to yourself when you're about 16, gee, I'd like to be an outcast. I'd like to do something with my life that makes everybody repulsed at me, that makes it hard for me to get jobs, that disappoints my parents. That's what I think I'll do. So those groups would say that these people can either go through the therapy to become heterosexual, or if they can't or won't, they can recognize that they have these homosexual feelings and decide to live celibate lives. This is their choice. This is how those folks look at it.
Your experience at Gethsemane, repercussions once you became a reconciling in Christ, monetarily, membership-wise?
We have grown. We have grown tremendously since that time. When the decision came down, the president of the congregation left. He was very opposed to it. I am told he was not someone who was a longtime member there. He was a fairly recent member. He was opposed to it. He left. Very few people left, other than him. We have grown tremendously since we've done that. Like I said, I'm only guessing, but I am guessing that we have about a dozen homosexual couples at Gethsemane, and a few homosexual folks who are not coupled. They add greatly to the texture of our parish, and they're hardworking people. They're good. Their faith is as deep as mine and yours. They are looking for a place to worship God and to follow where God is leading them. And if we say to these people, you are not worthy of us, what are we telling them to do? What are we saying? The word welcome means welcome. When you say that you are a welcoming parish, you have to ask yourself, do we really mean that? Remember in the 60s? Can you remember, those of us with gray hair, can you remember back that far? When we decided, what would we do if a black person walked into our church? Doesn't that sound stupid now?
Yeah.
Does that not sound really, really stupid? I mean, but we had those conversations in South County. What would we do if a black person walked into our church? We don't even talk about that anymore. We're over it.
We heard an interview with this Pete, the guy that's running. He's from South Bend, Indiana. And he was interviewed by Judy Woodruff on PBS. Okay, and she asked him, what would you say to the people who may have an issue with you being gay? His answer was so right on. I thought he said, I guess I would say, if you have an issue, you might want to take it up with our maker.
Who made me this way?
Who made me? He said, we don't, our creator, yeah. He said, we don't, it's not like I woke up one day, we wake up one day and we decide we want to be gay. It's not, you know, if you're straight, you wake up one day and decide you're going to be straight. You know, he was so...
Yeah, it's kind of like being German or Irish, you know. Can somebody cure you of that? You know, can you go to classes and decide that you're not going to be German anymore? Like, please, stop it. You know, God made us all in a different way, and we're just, here's where I think the AIDS epidemic, and there wasn't much good about AIDS, I'll have to say, and I was one of the nurses that took care of those people when they were dying like flies. But the one good thing that came out of the AIDS epidemic was that it broke a myth, and the myth that we were all taught back then was that, yeah, there were these men who were effeminate and they were different, but there's like 1 in every 10,000. Maybe 1 in every 100,000 is like that. It's a rarity. It's odd. Well, then these people started dropping like flies from AIDS, and we realized this is more than 1 in 10,000. Some people think 1 in every 10 persons is gay or lesbian. That seems a little high to me, but the AIDS epidemic taught us that it's the guy next door to you, it's your dentist, it's your priest that is gay. People just like you, not some oddball running around in sequins in a parade, but it's a guy or a woman just like you. The guy sitting next to you at the Kiwanis Club meeting can be gay. And that's what AIDS taught us. You know, Rock Hudson, I mean, when he came out as gay, boom, he was a sex symbol. He was a male romantic lead figure, and he was gay. This was a shock to all of us, and I think that the AIDS revolution is what led to marriage equality, because it brought the whole gay thing out into the open. It made gay people obvious as sympathetic, normal human beings just like us who want to earn a living, live their lives, pay their taxes, have fun, and be good citizens.
And worship.
And worship. And worship. It's the one good thing that came out of AIDS. It opened our eyes. When all these people were obviously outed as being gay by dying of AIDS.
Yes, did you see the movie Boy Erased?
No, I want to. I haven't seen it
It's
yet.
really
Yeah.
good. It's based on a true story. It's based, and the guy wrote the book, and he went to gay therapy, and it was, I mean, it's awful what they do to those people.
I heard the interview with him on NPR, and it sounds like a fascinating story of how.
It's just sad. It
Yeah.
does make you want to cry to think Christians do this to other people. It's just horrible.
Yeah, and as I understand in the movie, his parents weren't bad people. They meant well.
His father was a minister.
Yeah. And his mom's the one that kind of saved him and got him from the place.
When I was in the ministry in Minnesota, this was before the ELCA approved of gayness even for lay people, forget clergy. There were a lot of clergy that we all knew were gay. Single men. I know one woman, but I mean, it was kind of in the air that this is, you know, don't be finding dates for this one. That's not the way they swing. And Chilstrom, our bishop, he knew it. He knew that these people were gay. It was one of those, let's not talk about it because the church is not ready to deal with it. Well, when Chilstrom was at the end of his bishopric in Minnesota, there was a lesbian woman who was a pastor, and she decided to come out. She decided that she was tired of pretending that she was just a single woman. And she talked to Chilstrom about it, and Chilstrom broke down in tears because he said, I wish you could. I wish, but the constitution of our church ties my hands. If you do this, I have to take you off the clergy roll. I have to. And it broke his heart. And then Chilstrom left and became the ELCA presiding bishop after that. And he became a real, because of this clergywoman, he became really active in the push that the ELCA has experienced toward recognizing gay folks and gay clergy as okay. Chilstrom lost a son when I was in ministry up there. His son committed suicide. And some folks think that there may have been some gay issues at the root of his son's death. That's what it takes sometimes. But if we keep pushing it to one side and saying, okay, you know, we know you're gay, just pretend you're a single man, you know, we're cheating ourselves. We're cheating ourselves by doing that, by saying just pretend. Tell a lie. Pretend to be something that you're not. The church is better off putting it out in the open. Here is what it is. Here is who we are. We're not going to play games. We're not going to pretend. When we say welcome in this church, by damn, we mean welcome. If you are Homo sapiens, walk in the door, and you are welcome. My thing is, if you're a dog, you should be able to go. I'd like to take my pets to church, but that's another issue. But certainly, with Homo sapiens, if you are a human being, you are welcome in this parish. And we are not going to judge you for who you are, what you believe, your marital status, your politics, your looks, or any other thing. You are welcome. Daughters, and they came and joined our church, and one of the older parishioners, was just chatting with the teenage girls and said, how did your family pick our parish to join? Because they had moved from out of town. And they said, we told our parents we wanted to go to an R.I.C. parish. And that's why I say your kids are watching this. If you look at the demographics of who is in favor of complete inclusion of gay folk, the difference is enormous between 80-year-olds and 20-year-olds, okay? Guess who's going to die first? Young people, people in the millennial generation, they don't get this. What is the big deal? Just as it sounds crazy to us say, oh my God, what would you do if a black person walked in this parish? Well, we'd offer them a bulletin and say, we're glad to see you. I mean, that's obvious to us, just to our kids who have gay friends. Of course, we love you, come in, you're part of who we are. So yeah, demographics are not in favor of those folks who are not going to be welcoming to gay and lesbian people. Because the people who are most opposed to that are us gray-haired folk, like myself, yes.
I was raised Catholic, and I can remember being a kid, and the Catholic nuns wouldn't let us sing certain songs because Martin Luther wrote that song. So,
Wow.
and I can remember my best friend. He was Baptist, and he went to his grandparents. I went to my parents to see if we could really be friends, because he said he wasn't supposed to be friends with me because I was a Catholic.
Oh my Lord, you know, we had such ignorant ideas back then. Sometimes I look at my childhood and wonder how we all survived it. It's like, I remember going to a conference with a fellow who was a Seventh-day Adventist minister, and we were talking in this long drive, and I asked him how, you know, his faith journey and stuff, and he said he started out his life as a Roman Catholic, raised in a Catholic family, and one day when he was about 10 years old, he and his little buddy decided that they wanted to become priests. So they wandered over to the rectory and they said to the father, we've decided, both of us, that we want to become priests. What do we have to do? So the priest looked at his friend and said, well, you know, you've got to make good grades in high school, then you go to college, then you go to seminary for college, and then there's a regular seminary, and blah, 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 blah. And he looked at my friend, who was a Seventh-day Adventist minister, and he said, but you can't become a priest. And he said, why? He said, because you're adopted.
Huh?
And an adopted child might be a bastard, and bastards cannot become priests.
I knew some priests that were bastards.
That's in a different sense. So, you know, the whole church, and I'm not just picking on the Catholics, we were just about as stupid. It's not just the Catholic Church. They are the slowest to wake up from this, but it's not just them. We all had attitudes about certain things. I remember in the parish that I served in Minnesota, the only person who was ever excommunicated from the parish was a guy who was excommunicated because he drank. And in that parish, let me tell you how it was. This is Swedish pietism of Minnesota. If you got, and this was true until the time I got there. If you wanted to be married in the church, it went without saying that there could be no alcohol at your wedding in the church basement. Okay, that went without saying. But if you had a reception anywhere else and there was alcohol, you couldn't be married in the church. How do you like them apples? You know, we need to think really, really hard about excluding people and be really careful that we're doing it in a spirit of love and for a right reason. You know, if someone in your parish is an alcoholic, excommunication is probably not the first thing you want to jump to. There might be other ways to be Christ to this person than kicking them out of the church.
I have nothing but praise for our welcoming task force. They've done a, you know, it's a hard job. There is division that we have all experienced. Do you have any words of wisdom for us as we go through this journey? I mean, not everybody's here that I wish were here as part of this conversation, and you know, I know there's some people that disagree with me. I can't think of a better loving congregation, but we already feel some cracks there. Any advice for us as we go through this towards our voting time in May?
My feeling is this, and this is true of when pastors come and leave as well. When a pastor comes to a church, and I'm saying this from the context of being one of the very first women pastors, okay? People said, oh my God, when you come to the church, people are going to leave in droves. There are a few, but people came in droves too.
Yeah.
And that's the way church life is. There are people who will leave your parish. Give them a big party, and wish them well at the Baptist church. There are many ways to be a Christian, and they're not all Lutheran. If there are people that feel strongly about that, there are many Christian churches that share their views. Treat them with love. But don't compromise what's right over that. When I came to my parish in Hinckley, there were 3 women who were very vocal about leaving. Women, mind you. And I can tell you this from personal experience, that the big opposition to women clergy was from women, not men. It was from women. 3 of them were extremely angry, very upset. One of them left the parish, and she also left the town, and I didn't hear much more from her. One of the others was an older lady, Edith Kofed. She had taught 5th grade Sunday school for years, and she was really angry about this. But when my daughter was born, boy, that ended it. She fell in love with my child, and all bets were off, so she was fine. The 3rd one was a woman from a very prominent family in town. Family that kind of ran the town. They had some money and they had a lot of influence. And she was opposed to this women thing. She became a Roman Catholic. And of course, like any convert, she became a super Catholic. She was there every time the bell rang. The priest was really tired of her. She was a very intelligent woman, very intelligent, had a master's degree. Her brother had at least 1 doctorate. Kind of an odd woman, let's say, never married. And after I was there about 3 years, she started sending me letters in the mail. Now, when I saw the first letter with her return address, I thought, oh Lord, no, this is Marjorie. What now? So I opened it up, and it was a long letter telling me how much she admired me. And we kept up this bizarre communication through the mail for a couple of years before I left. She couldn't stand to say to anyone out loud that she had second feelings about female clergy. But we had this long conversation in the mail that was really weird. She would ask me about philosophical topics and what I thought about this and what I thought about that. And I would answer her as she spoke to me through the mail. When we saw each other on the street, we would simply nod and pass. Now, you can't control what happens to people who leave. They're going to do their own thing. God is watching out for them too. They will come to God's truth in their own way. Don't feel responsible for it. You're not kicking them out. If you do the right thing, they will have to do what they feel they need to do, and God is watching them as well.